We could repatriate Versailles to Blackpool. Now that is satire.
I think we could send the House of Lords to Stonehenge, make them all dress as druids. Sorted. Patriotic. Love it. Welcome one and all. Welcome to How to Win an Election. I'm Hugo Rifkind, sheltering from the heat generated by feverish speculation about Andy Burnham's cabinet, the equivalent of a couple of small nuclear reactors, at least all that. And I'm joined as ever by former Labour insider Sally Morgan. Sally, hello.
Hello.
Have you spent the week playing fantasy cabinet manager?
Not yet.
Not yet?
No. Give me time.
Okay, I will give you time. Maybe you can do it for us now. We're also joined by policy queen Polly Mackenzie. Her policy sense is tingling right now.
Yeah, some new things might happen. Isn't it exciting?
It is very exciting, in a way. And Tory peer and Times columnist, fan of fruitcake, but not of loonies or closet racists, is Danny Finkelstein. Hello, Danny.
Hello. You know, Sally played real cabinet creation, so she doesn't have to do fantasy ones. When I got to the end of Andy Burnham's book, which I was only part of the way through, there is, which Sally referred to, the mention about her and the seat that Andy Burnham got, which implies that she didn't help him much with the seat, but she was just there. When I finally got to the acknowledgements, there is Sally for having helped his career, and I realised, although it says in the text that she didn't fix the seat, when I got to the acknowledgements, I realised she did, because otherwise she wouldn't have been there. So just remember who we're dealing with here.
Well, look, we're going to talk about, obviously, assembling a cabinet, assembling a Downing Street team, whether to move some of them up to the north of England, and whether Danny is right to say that Andy Burnham has a chance to slow down that revolving door to number 10. I love the bit in your column where you refer to, I know it's not your joke, but you refer to it, how number 10 has come to resemble an Airbnb because so many people are moving in and out of it.
Sent to me by a Chelsea friend.
A very, very good gag. Let's dive right in. Sally, look, we're at the stage where almost everybody is being tipped for almost every job. Every Labour MP is going out of their way to say they've always been a fan of Andy Burnham. Can he afford to take his time assembling his cabinet?
Well, he's obviously going to have to do it the day after he becomes Prime Minister. He might be quietly doing it. He might be doing quiet work now. But I think he is being very, very tight. I don't think anybody knows what they've got or are going to get, and it may be that's because he hasn't done the work yet. I mean, he only had he only had James starting as Chief of Staff effectively yesterday, so he's not got many people around him yet who really understand Whitehall.
But hasn't he been doing the work for the last 2 years? Hasn't he been lying there at night staring at the ceiling going, I put him there and I put her there? No,
I don't think so.
Really?
No, I don't
Why
think
not?
so.
Everyone else has.
No, I don't think so.
It's only become relatively recently clear that he would become Prime Minister. I know that he's been in play for about a year. Before that, don't forget, Keir Starmer had just won a landslide majority. So when this book that I referred to, when he was writing that and publishing it, the idea that he was going to become Prime Minister within 2 years of this landslide didn't seem that likely.
Completely.
Can he do it without creating lots of enemies? He's going to make enemies of the people he doesn't put in.
You can't. You've always got to balance all sorts of things when you're putting a cabinet together. So above all, one would hope that you go for capable people, because ultimately that's really important. And people who can lead a political team, also really important, because sometimes you can have sort of maverick brilliance, but if they can't lead junior ministers and the wider team and give direction, it won't work. So you've got to pick the right people. But you've also, of course, you have to look at political balance to an extent. Of course you do. And you do. He will have to think hard, I would have thought, about how many people he wants to push out of the current cabinet, because yes, some of them may go gracefully, but some may not. And if they go not gracefully and they have following in the PLP, that becomes problematic.
I mean, Danny, David Cameron sort of made a lot of enemies by not giving them jobs and by sacking them from jobs, and it was a sort of understated aspect of even the Brexit referendum, all the people he'd sort of alienated by not having them in the core team.
The first thing that happened when he became Prime Minister was that the Conservative Party didn't win the election fully. It was in coalition with the Liberal Democrats. That meant that quite a lot of people who held front bench positions then couldn't be put in the government. He did try and move some of those people in later, but it definitely caused a problem. And people are part of politics, inevitably, and their feelings and their feeling that they ought to be leader. And I remember talking to somebody who I thought had a potential for a really strong ministerial career, and he'd basically started to poke at George and Osborne and David Cameron in a way that made it very difficult for him to be appointed to anything. And I could not understand what he was trying to do. But I think in the end I realised he felt resentful that they were the leadership when he felt he had the talent to do it. And actually did have quite a lot of talent. So I saw what his point was, but I think you just so people do feel those kind of hurt feelings. They're a really important part of politics.
Polly, have you been following the slightly forlorn machinations of Rachel Reeves? She's saying today that she supports Andy Burnham to be PM, and Sky News has reported that her team has been working the phones to make the case for her staying. She's not going to stay, is she?
I think it's unlikely that the Prime Minister wouldn't want his own chancellor, but I think, there is... For all that Danny talks about personal feelings, and those are right, actually having some humility about public service is also really, really valuable. And, when William Hague, who had been the leader and then came back, was an excellent foreign secretary. David Cameron came back as a foreign secretary. That willingness to take a different role, which seems to be part of what's being briefed about Rachel Reeves as well, seems to me like actually a sign of really admirable character, that she has valued contributing to, the nation's life, and she would value carrying on. Good for her.
But it doesn't happen very often. Danny, the BBC's Henry Zeffman, formerly of this parish, says you have to go back to 1983 to find a chancellor who took a less senior role, which is when Margaret Thatcher moved Geoffrey Howe to foreign secretary. So it's unusual for a chancellor to carry on. One can sort of make a Nadeem Zahawi case, but it's pretty forlorn too.
Yes, and obviously, John Major moved Norman Lamont out and offered him something else, but he didn't take it. Yeah. Yes, Geoffrey Howe was the only example. He actually didn't feel... He did want to stay as Chancellor, but she wasn't moving it out to slight him. She wanted to get rid of Francis Pym. Yeah. She wanted to appoint Cecil Parkinson to be Foreign Secretary, but Cecil Parkinson informed him her before the... before she did it, that it had this relationship that made it difficult. So he couldn't be appointed. So she ends up appointing Geoffrey Howe, Foreign Secretary. He thought he was originally slated, according to her notebooks and the archives show, to be Home Secretary, which is what he expected, which would probably have been a bigger step down, interesting in status, but possibly more significant in terms of the actual role. So Foreign Secretary's gone through this sort of odd thing where it retains this very strong prestige, but prime ministers do so much of their own foreign policy that it declines. I do wonder just a little bit whether he might be tempted to offer Keir Starmer the Foreign Office, because it might help him with foreign relations. And I was talking to someone yesterday who said, one of the problems of you changing your Prime Minister so often is that all the foreign leaders wonder whether anything they were told before still holds. So there is something to that. And you can't appoint him to a big domestic role because he's too unpopular.
But if he makes him Foreign Secretary, doesn't that mean that he's essentially still the Prime Minister abroad, and Andy Burnham's left doing kind of half the job?
But I think I've thought this for quite a long time. I don't think he will, but I've thought that, and I think it's become harder. I thought quite a while ago that's what I would do, because I actually think Keir would be good at it. I always thought he'd be a better Foreign Secretary than Prime Minister. I never thought he was going to be a particularly good Prime Minister. Sadly, I think I was proved right in that. But I did think he'd be a good Foreign Secretary. And I look at David Cameron, and I think one of the things that's quite interesting, if you've been Prime Minister and you become Foreign Secretary, is when you go to other countries, you see the Prime Minister because they know you. So you don't just see the Foreign Minister, but you actually see the Prime Minister. And I think that was one of the things that was really interesting with Cameron, that it elevated British foreign policy in a sense, in terms of the network and the contacts. So it's not to be sneezed at, in my view.
But I mean, wouldn't it just weaken Burnham doing that?
I think Burnham.
It would seem weird when he was he'd barely be the guy meeting Donald Trump. He'd be playing second fiddle.
I don't know whether he would mind very much about that. I think he's very focused on domestic politics. It's where his interest is. It's what he wants to be preoccupied by. He won't want to spend his time abroad all the time, but inevitably that happens. So in many ways, I actually think it would play to both their strengths.
He's hardly said a word about foreign policy at any point. He said a lot about other things, which I think is people underestimate just how much is out there of what Andy Burnham thinks and feels and believes and wants to do. But what's interesting is almost nothing on defence, almost nothing on foreign policy. So it will be very interesting to see what he does in that. I'm not saying he's going to do that. I don't think it would remotely make him look smaller. I think it would make him look bigger. It'd be more effective. It would be good for Labour unity. But it's not something he has to do. Keir Starmer can and will walk off, and I don't think he'll prove to be an undermining force outside. It's just that it's something that he could do, and I just think it's worthwhile bearing in mind.
Is there something to be said, Polly, for a Prime Minister who is sort of first and foremost very obviously focused on the domestic?
I think so. One of the reasons why Trump was so successful at getting elected was because he basically gave the impression he just wanted to stop doing foreign policy, a much more kind of like America first. We're just not interested in being the world's policeman, in defending other countries, any of that stuff. He obviously has not honoured those pledges and commitments in the last couple of years as president. But the story of, like, sort of stop the world, I want to get off, is really compelling politically, and saying let's make Britain more energy independent, let's make Britain more able to kind of stand on our own feet in terms of not needing immigration. The problem is that you can tell that story really strongly, and a Prime Minister who doesn't flit around the world caring about things would probably be more popular. The challenge is that the world doesn't stop, and our economic fortunes, our national security are enormously influenced by the decisions of America, our relationships with the European Union. And if you're going to strengthen our economy, you've just got to be out there talking to those people.
Let's talk a bit about Ed Miliband, because he is. It seems contentious, but he is certainly one of the front runners to be Andy Burnham's Chancellor. Look, Burnham himself, Sally, served in the Blair and Brown governments, as did Ed Miliband. It's hard. Burnham, I guess, sort of was at times on both sides, but Ed Miliband was very clearly on the Gordon Brown side. Would Andy Burnham be worried about the spectre of a sort of rekindling a Blair Brown style rivalry if he put someone?
No, I don't think so. No, I don't think so. I mean, I think actually in some ways the opposite, almost, in the sense that I think they're close. I think they're good friends. It's more what would people read into the appointment, I think. I guess particularly the market. So. Yep. Look, Andy, as I remember him, he did serve in. He wasn't really a Blairite and he wasn't really a Brownite. He was Andy Burnham. I would say he was close to anybody. He was close to David Blunkett. So whether that makes you a Blunketite, I don't know. But anyway, that's the person I would say. If I was trying to nail him, I'd say that's the person he was actually really, really close to. And I think Ed clearly, obviously he worked for Gordon, but he was away for quite a lot. In the second term, he was away. He was at Harvard, he was doing some visiting fellowship or something. He was not around that much. So it was obviously later on that they will have spent real time together.
Sally, can I ask you, what was James Purnell's relationship like with Ed Miliband?
I think friendly. I don't think they were particularly close politically. I mean, Ed was always somebody who was quite, even though there were lots of challenges, shall we say, between the different teams, teams of advisors. Ed was not somebody that didn't get on with people. So he was around. But I think they got on. But they didn't work together closely politically.
I can remember one former Downing Street advisor telling me that Ed was known in Tony Blair's office as the emissary from Planet F Word.
Yes, I think I do remember that.
Yes, indeed.
Yes.
We're going to come back to James Purnell in a minute, so do stick around for that. Polly, you are the president of this podcast's Ed Miliband fan club. Population 1 and a bit sometimes. Would you like to make the case for him as Chancellor?
Well, it's funny because I really took against Ed Miliband 2010 to 2015 when he was the leader, and I remember the day when Nick Clegg made his resignation speech going, oops, I've destroyed a political party. But he did that with a sense of deep humility and acknowledgement, still confident that he'd done the right thing, but and Ed Miliband gave this speech on the same day, an hour later, and obviously I was emotionally overwrought at the time, but it was all like, yeah, it was a great ride, and like Miller-fandom, and I just despised him. However, I honour always.
I love the journey.
Like, good policy making is like what you get into government for, and I really admire what Ed Miliband has done as the Secretary of State. I admire the extent to which he was actually prepared for it in depth. in opposition. I mean, some stuff's changed, of course. And he was the only person who took mission-driven government seriously, which is not about having 5 things that you put on a pledge card, was about actually a different coordinating principle for how you get government, the private sector and civil society to operate together towards common goals across the nation. And that is the right theory of how to do governing in the 21st century. And he's the only person who read the memo. So as an intellectual, I can see him taking that into the Treasury. The challenge is, though, that the Treasury is the biggest barrier to mission-driven government that there is. So does he go in and immediately just catch Treasury-itis? Or does he go in and actually allow us to do radical changes, like changing how we do accounting officer rules around departmentals to break silos so we can achieve goals? Do we think differently about how investment is counted, whether the investment is for defence, security, or the things that you call investment, like buying schools and hospitals, which are great and important, but not actually investments? I think that could be really exciting.
So I think it's important that Andy Burnham appoints a chancellor who wants to do the things that Andy Burnham wants to do, and I don't agree with the idea that it's nothing that Andy Burnham really wants. There's going to be a question now about whether he has got the courage to see those things through, whether he feels he's got the mandate, because I don't. Actually, I would put in parenthesis, there's lots he wants to do that I don't think he ever asked anybody about, because he put them in a book and made a few speeches that were made in Manchester, but they weren't. One of the reasons Keir Starmer didn't put those things forward is because he didn't think he could win if he did. So, so I think there's a big question about a mandate. However, he does have some things he wants to do. So the question is whether Ed Miliband would do them, because he's a good executive, and because he's a bit like Michael Gove, he's fixed on what he wants to actually achieve, and he's quite good at making people do what he wants to achieve. Or would he get in the way because the things that he wants to achieve are not what Andy Burnham wants to achieve? Part of it is, so Andy Burnham does believe, if you believe what he thinks he said before, in a green industrial revolution, and he was in favour of the £28 billion that Ed Miliband wanted. You'll remember that from before the election. But on the other hand, Andy Burnham's big thing is, let's make the Treasury and Treasury rules less London focused, and distribute money around the country. That is absolutely critical to him. The question is whether Ed Miliband is too London, therefore, right? Is it, it's particularly if you were to appoint a kind of Londonish Foreign Secretary or Home Secretary, you'd then end up back where Labour has been, which is one London leader after another.
Is there not also, I know Keir Starmer's probably not going to be his Foreign Secretary, but if you have Andy Burnham with Keir Starmer as his Foreign Secretary and Ed Miliband as his Chancellor, he's going to look like a little boy walking on the street swinging from his parents' hands.
I don't think you could really do both. It's less that than that those are hardly winners of the popularity contest of the year. So there is a political problem with doing it. But as we've said from the beginning, and Polly's always very insistent on this, but I completely agree with it, that the key thing now is he's got to make his government work. So the first question he should work is not what will the public think, because frankly they won't think about it that much. The question is, will it actually deliver what he thinks is necessary to change the country? And we said that after the last general election, Keir Starmer didn't really know what he wanted to do, didn't have people therefore who could do the things that he didn't know he wanted to do. This is actually could be different, and he's therefore got to choose people who are going to do it. So the question with Ed Miliband is, does he buy into this agenda, and can he do it? When you express it like that, you have to think to yourself, maybe he actually does. And so if he does, then I think it would be a smart choice, even though I can't confirm the things that Andy Burnham wants to do are not what I would do, but I'm not going to become Prime Minister.
Yeah, sure. As well as appointing a government, Andy Burnham needs to build a team to join him in Downing Street. And one eye-catching name, James Purnell, who served with him in the Blair-Brown years, will be his Chief of Staff. Sally, is this reassuring news for the Blairites? Is it reassuring news for everyone?
I think it's reassuring news for the country, actually. I mean, the country won't care, but for those people who want the government to be functional and to be purposeful and to get things done, and for the civil service to be reformed and for policy to be followed through, I think it's very good news.
OK. Polly, you've worked closely with James Purnell in the past, and you also know how Downing Street works. Is he going to make a good Chief of Staff?
I think he's going to be excellent. So I worked with him for a couple of years. He was the Vice-Chancellor at University of the Arts, London. And that's a sort of interesting thing to me. I mean, has there been anybody who's ever worked in Downing Street who has formerly been the Vice-Chancellor of a university? I genuinely don't think so.
Are they similar gigs?
A team, leading a big team of people.
Because, I mean, you know, UAL's £500 million a year organisation, pretty substantial, actually. Common
room full of egos.
But also, crucially, you have to govern a university like a city, it's not a command and control structure. Yes, exactly. Everybody is sort of slightly there working at the university rather than for the university in the academic community. So I think he had a lot of skills from that job, from his job in kind of lobbying, running the Flint, I'm sure they would say they're not lobbyists, regulatory consultancy. And before that at the BBC. So again, that's the other thing that's notable about him is he left politics to do proper jobs in the real world, and has a lot of experience there. He's got, you know, deep values and beliefs. And a deep understanding of the creative industries, and from a kind of foreign policy perspective, the soft power angle. You know, so James and I put together a report with a brilliant woman called Eliza Easton on how to better leverage the UK's soft power a few years ago, which led to the creation under David Lammy of a soft power council, which you know, as has been reported, that since David Lammy stepped down as Foreign Secretary, it's sort of fallen apart, and you know, nobody cares. I can imagine that, for example, being reanimated by James, though it won't be the top thing on the list. And again, you know, one of the nation's absolutely critical assets is the knowledge economy, universities, and so his understanding of what international students do, not to crowd British people out of universities, but in fact to pay for British people to afford to go to university. He's a real grown-up. He's really smart. He never stopped being in love with politics, I think.
Or policy.
You know, or policy.
Or policy.
He's like actually one of his proudest achievements, and he was critically involved in setting up the Pensions Commission, which is one of the best pieces of policy redesign in a generation, frankly. And he understood that you needed to both do the serious policy work and change the hearts and minds, do lots of public work. And he was open about actually working on a cross-party basis to get that to happen.
Can I add another point, which is temperament? So I think I also share this view. It's interesting that I share it, because although we sound like the James Purnell fan club, this is because we've all worked with him in different ways.
I think he's all right.
That's the view that you get. That's the view that you get from doing so. One of the crucial things is temperament. That is a crucial part of being chief of staff. It's a very influential role, but you do need somebody who's got enough authority and self-confidence to deal with the cabinet and other major players, but doesn't either think they should or try to dominate the Prime Minister or become seen as the kind of major player. So I think he's temperamentally very well suited to it. I did want to ask Sally a question, because we talked about it a little bit before we came on air, and I'd wanted to share that about his politics, because one of the big question that arises is, you know, if you're thinking of Ed Miliband to be Chancellor and you're thinking about James Purnell to be Chief of Staff, is this a vast gulf? That's why I asked the question I did about Ed Miliband. Does it suggest that, you know, a bit of him's doing a book with Steve Rotherham, who was PPS to Jeremy Corbyn, and the other bit is appointing James Purnell to be his Chief of Staff? Who is this guy? But you actually had an interesting view about Purnell's politics.
Well, I mean, I think James has got his own politics. I don't think he was a fantastic SPAD minister, ultimately cabinet minister, and worked very closely with Tony Blair, but I wouldn't define him per se as a Blairite. He certainly wasn't a Brownite. I mean, he didn't get on with Gordon, and that was almost about style rather than content. Yes, I think it was about style. I think it was about do it my way or no other way. I think James wants to argue policy through in a very constructive way, but he wants to have the discussion and he wants to get somewhere, and then he wants to work out how do you build consensus. That was not really Gordon's style. So that didn't play for James. And James also just thought, I don't need to do this. I'm not going to stay in politics if this is how it's got to be. But I think one of the things that's really interesting is that I remember talking to ministers who are a lot older than James, who worked particularly in DWP, actually, and in fact in culture, who all said to me it was the best it was the best team they'd ever been part of. And that's because he was a good he was a good leader and a good political leader, but he's a good team leader, and he worked with other civil servants as well, which I think plays well. But I think his politics, I don't think it's yin and yang. I don't think Andy will be as crude as saying, I want a bit of that and I want a bit of that to make this all mixed together. But I don't think it would be very helpful to think, well, they've got James and he's brackets Blair, and therefore we'll have Ed because he's a bit of Brown. I think life's just is more complicated than that, and it's well moved on from there anyway.
Can I just make a tiny thing, which is he's obviously still got to extract himself from Flint, and though you said it wasn't a lobbyist, they wouldn't see themselves as that, but they are registered lobbyists. So, as you know, but and therefore there will be some questions about that. I only pointed out because these things have a habit of tripping people up, particularly because of the Peter Mandelson vetting.
They were very clear yesterday that he'd resigned and had no financial link back still with him. And he only worked there a year, 18 months, didn't he?
Before we move on from this, though, Danny, Andy Burnham, Ed Miliband, James Purnell, you've still got Yvette Cooper floating around, maybe David Lammy too. Is this not looking a bit like a sort of retreat to the comfort zone of 20 years ago?
Well, it's interesting.
More than 20 years ago, indeed.
Well, I don't think you could call David Lammy that. And after all, these people were advisor generation. They were quite young. So
I mean, they were all in the cabinet, though.
That's true. It's true that, well, not Lammy wasn't, I don't think.
Was he not yet in the cabinet?
No.
Right.
I mean, that which is actually tells his own story, but still. So, there's obviously a question over that, but I really, in the end, don't think people care that much about that. They didn't know, even we just stumble over the question of whether David Lammy was in the cabinet. So I don't think most people are kind of going, I'm a bit worried about recycling him. But so the only thing that matters now is that Andy Burnham knows what he wants and has got a strategy, and which I think he does, and has got a strategy for achieving it, which is a more open question. That's the only thing that will make his success, and whether his exact personnel should only be selected in order to help him to achieve those things. That's the crucial thing with the Chancellor. Does he share the agenda? Can he help create a strategy for getting him from where he is now to where he wants to be? And that's the only thing that should be on his mind as he chooses.
Well, let's talk a bit about what parts of the agenda might be. Mark from Essex has emailed, and of course you can email on howtowin@thetimes.co.uk. He writes, "Hi Polly, Danny, Sally and Hugo. Thank you for the podcast. I'm a huge fan. I've never missed an episode. As some of you... hold on, it's gone. There we are. As some of you may know, I'm a huge fan of the disruptive idea. Big supporter of votes for babies, Polly.
Hooray!
So here's one. Should Andy relocate Parliament to Manchester? At least for the time it takes to do it up. It would save billions on the cost of refurbishment, open the eyes of MPs to life outside the M25, and tactically might wrong-foot opposition leaders who literally wouldn't know their way around. And it might mean throwing the monopoly board in the air for the civil service, which might provoke more change there too. It would show he's prepared to think the unthinkable and shake things up. What does the panel think?" Well, Mark, Andy Burnham seems to be on your wavelength, sort of, because we learned from the FT that he wants to set up a number 10 in the north, moving at least parts of the Downing Street operation to Manchester. His team have declined to comment on this when it was put to them, but you never know. Polly, what's not to like?
Well, I do like the very disruptive idea of moving Parliament to Manchester, and in fact, he can't be that diligent a listener because I've talked about it here before, and he obviously hasn't been keeping notes. But And there's a little part of me that's quite seduced by this idea of Andy Burnham's, assuming it's true, of basically he gets given an opportunity to go to Manchester once a week, keep touch with his constituency, broadcast a sense of being in the north. And I like that. The risk is which part of the Downing Street operation, because it's not going to be the private office, it can't be the ceremonial people, it can't be the comms team. What do you mean?
It could just be him.
Well, it could just be him, but and so therefore I get it. The idea is because if you do build a new Parliament in Manchester or convert something, and you've still got to do up Parliament in London to stop it just falling into the sea or poisoning babies or something, then that's a lot of money. I think though this is just a little bit too clever. As a sort of simplistic solution, because you need a much stronger story about really what is happening in Manchester that is different and why you're there. I think I came up with two other ideas. One is actually to go for Blackpool instead. You know,
I just want to check.
it's very hard to get to.
I just want to check, are these satirical ideas or
No,
real
this
ones?
is a real
'Cause it's
idea.
sometimes hard to know.
Yeah, no, I'm being disruptive.
Yeah.
Well, so it's super hard to get to Blackpool.
Yep.
But it is. What if you think of what Trump has with
got a
both
lot of large conferencey.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So I don't think he should put.
Fallen Town,
I don't think he should put the number 10 operation there. That doesn't make any sense. But actually thinking about a kind of Mar-a-Lago / Camp David / Aspen retreat, so that you could actually
In Blackpool.
Blackpool needs turning around, and if you want to symbolise like a new hope for Britain, actually Manchester's amazing. It's been amazing for a really long time, and he's been part of that. But actually, if he wants to tell a story about turnaround and hope for forgotten places, just being in Manchester is kind of annoying to Blackpool or Retford, or I'm just going to stop listing places that will be offended that I think that they're a bit rubbish. So I think creating a destination, actually what he should get rid of is Chequers.
That's what I said last
Don't
week.
do
See,
Chequers.
He's not
Just
listening well enough, is he? Because I
Pick
mean,
a different
that's
place.
what I said last week.
And take people there and make that the place where you have summits
Yeah,
and
that's
conferences.
exactly
And if
what I
that means
thought.
you need to put it in an airport, then so be it.
That's exactly
Danny, your face.
No,
Sort of, I mean, I'd like
Well, we
podcasters
could
to be able
just-
to visualise what a look of
Actually-
incredulity on Danny Finkelstein's face
So
looks
not only
like. It'd be
I don't-
captioned "What the," wouldn't it?
Blackpool isn't Polly's. Actually, probably is one of her better ideas.
Shots
No,
fired.
it's not. It's not one of your. It's along with the babies. It's not a very good idea.
Move on, yeah.
But the truth is that you have to have a centre somewhere, and otherwise you just sort of spread the MPs all around the country. But I do think. Two things. First of all, it's not in itself a bad idea to move some part of the operation. Chequers is quite a good idea. The House of Lords is another possibility. Somewhere else other than London. You've got to, I think, in a parliamentary democracy, you've got to have your administrative centre and your parliament in the same place. So, and I'm not sure how much you achieve after a while by moving that to Manchester, which, as Polly correctly said, is already. But I think it's a strong, already quite strong. But I think it's a strong idea. Secondly, it is very much part of what he wants to try to do, and it fits very well with his message, and I think would be valuable in itself. So I think this is definitely a runner. I'd be surprised if he doesn't do some quite bold thing about moving somewhere.
Something
If I were him, I wouldn't be Manchester. It was very interesting on that, the question time, almost the only time when Rob Kenyon, the Reform candidate for Makerfield, said anything sort of interesting was when he started to complain from a Wigan perspective about Manchester, right? And I think the problem is if he does everything with Manchester, quickly the rest of the country will get fed up with Manchester, and they'll start going, well, Manchester and London are like that.
Exactly.
So he needs to find other places, whether it's Birmingham or Sheffield, but the problem with Blackpool is
It's really
just,
far away.
and also it's become such a declining place. There's nowhere to stay, so you'd have to do a lot. It would cost a lot of money, and of course that is part of your point, isn't it? Which is you'd have to regenerate it. But why there when there are other places which are nearer to being regenerated?
Before we move on from this, Sally, Jonathan Powell said one of the things that one of the things preventing a move of Downing Street or part of Downing Street was that foreign leaders always wanted to be photographed going through the door. Is that kind of thing? Or is that something a real problem?
I mean, I don't quite buy that, because I remember Tony taking George Bush to Trimdon, and he absolutely loved it. I think there's a certain type of leader.
Remind our listeners, because obviously I know where Trimdon is.
Oh, it's County Durham. It's County Durham, and it was the ex-miners bit of County Durham, but it's where the Labour Club was, which sadly is no longer a Labour Club. But he went to the pub, and George Bush loved it. The locals loved it. Tony loved it, and they were more relaxed. They had a really good conversation. So yes, there's a certain prestige, but they also like going to Chequers. So if there was a Chequers in the north, they'd be perfectly happy to be photographed there, in my view.
Polly, you can see Donald Trump in the Winter Gardens, though. He'd love it.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
There's probably some algae floating around in a pond somewhere to make him feel at home. But I think, Obama went to Stonehenge, right?
Exactly.
And also, I think it's perfectly fine to keep Downing Street as a ceremonial location. It's pretty useful for holding charity receptions. It just, you can move the administrative centre away from your ceremonial headquarters, and you can have, like in France, they have the Élysée and then they have Versailles, and they're still pretty close. We could repatriate Versailles to Blackpool. Now that is satire.
I think we could send the House of Lords to Stonehenge and make them all dress as druids. Sorted. Patriotic. Love it. Danny, I want to talk about your column in the Times this week, which everyone should read if they, for some unforgivable reason, haven't read already. You make a big call. You say that Burnham has the chance to stop the carousel of prime ministers whirling through Downing Street. How might he do that, and how likely is he to manage to do that?
OK, so my theory is that you need a big imaginative political idea to meet a very difficult time. We've gone through a carousel of prime ministers because we do, when there's a big political realignment, when there are big political needs, you have to find an idea that can reshape the agenda and cut the cake a little differently, or I don't know whether that's a good metaphor, but you get the idea. I think this idea of the north-south divide, Britain's got only one productive place, which is London. It needs more productive places. People's ordinary lives have been ignored by Westminster. Some of it I thought was a bit tendentious, and he comes up with the idea that he somehow lived a second-class life himself when he's been to Cambridge, been a SPAD, been in the cabinet, and been mayor of Manchester. But nevertheless, I thought it had some political punch, and it is a different way of looking at, so the resentment that Reform has is towards migrants, and the Greens have got billionaires. He's got this north-south divide. It's actually, you can do some things about it. There is an agenda that relates to it, and if he's got boldness to see it through, it has at least the possibility of reshaping the way that the political debate takes place. That's what I was suggesting. Now, it wouldn't be, those are not what he was suggesting is not my politics. I think some of it is completely unwise, and a lot of it would be very expensive and would mean having to raise taxes and would reduce growth. So I don't think it would work in itself. But some of it, which is the idea that we're too London-centred and nowhere else in the country is productive enough, that was the idea of George Osborne and the Northern Powerhouse, which I was very involved in. And making a reality of that, I've always thought there's politics and policy in that.
Sally, do you think that work? I mean, the public won't like it if it's called yet another reset. There've been a lot of resets. I
don't think it's a reset. I think it's Andy setting out what he intends to do, and then the challenge for him is doing it. But I think he is pretty clear what he wants to do, and I think that is, that's the starting point, and that's what we haven't had. I think the other thing I'd say, in addition to what Danny said, is I think the additional thing he genuinely wants to do, and I think has demonstrated in his time in Manchester, is a less adversarial approach to politics, whether that's about how he operates within Parliament, but more importantly, how he sets out to do things. And as Polly said, one of the things that's interesting is that James did that on pensions. And that has been, and my impression strongly is that's been his instinct and the way he's worked in Manchester. So he's worked to bring people together, to build consensus, to move things forward, whether that's, working with business, whether it's working with different parties, whatever. I think that will be what he tries to bring to politics. I think a lot of the British public will like that, and it may be quite challenging for some of the other parties, but I think he'll be able to turn that to his benefit if he does it clearly enough. If he's clear, he says, this is how I want to work, and I'm inviting you to help me take this big problem forward and come to a solution. And they say, well, no. Then that in a sense is something that will win for him. It's not where he'd want to be. I actually think he'd want people to do it with him, but it should isolate some of the people.
Polly, what do you think of his chances of having a less adversarial politics with them? Let me just check this. Kemi Badenoch.
Yes.
But I think you can make that stuff look petty by just being above it. So it's absolutely in his hands. We've talked, and I know, Danny has the view that there ought to be an election. Lots of people will poke. There are basically infinite constitutional holes you can poke in the idea that he now has a mandate to govern. But what matters really is whether he's any good. If he's good, it will only be weird constitutionalists who care about the details. If he's rubbish, then all of those petty details just become sticks to beat him with. And so it is on him to do the reset. We talked about Keir Starmer's need for a reset. We've talked about team. I think that question of how do you hire 12 brilliant people to work in Downing Street, but how do you kind of cast a team of people working to a common agenda as allies with one another and with you? That's what matters. And then if they run the country really well for 2 years, they might just hold on to the majority.
Let's finish with an email we've had from Lisa. She writes, had Starmer allowed Andy Burnham to stand in Gorton and Denton, would we be facing a different dilemma today, or would Starmer still be making way for somebody else? I love a bit of blue sky thinking. Danny, what do you think?
I think in the end he'd be making way for Andy Burnham even with it, but it might have played out differently. Yes. So I think he thought, they thought the one thing that Andy Burnham didn't have was a seat in Parliament, so if they could stop him from doing that, he wouldn't challenge, because they felt that if they let him into Parliament, he'd challenge, and if he challenged, he'd win. And that, I think that maths, that political maths at the time, it held at the time, and it's still right looking back at it. But there is a chance that he'd have let him in, he'd have got in, and then there would have been a gap which Andy Burnham would have had to fill before becoming, so the coronation wouldn't have happened in quite the same way, because this would have taken place before the local elections.
This is assuming he'd won Gorton and Denton, of course.
It's assuming that, but I think that is a good assumption. He would have won Gorton and Denton. Right. I thought that at the time, actually, but it's now obvious that was what would have happened. So I think it would have. He probably hadn't changed much by refusing him then, probably. But there's a small chance that Andy Burnham would have dropped the ball between getting elected before the election and now, and then we'd have a challenge to Keir. He'd still have to stand down, but it would be more open contest.
And also, you wouldn't be in a position that you're now in, which is that Andy has demonstrated that he can take on reform. He wouldn't have had. He would have been taking on the Greens. It would have been a really different setup. I mean, I thought they should have let Andy stand, but I think for Andy Burnham, in fact, it was probably a good thing that they didn't, because I think he's entered him stronger.
Well, if I had breath in my body politically and I'd been in Downing Street, I definitely wouldn't have let him stand. The only reason I let him stand is because he couldn't stop it.
That's all we've got time for. Look, do keep sending your messages, questions, comments and so on. We do love to read them. And that's it this week for the James Purnell Fan Club. We're planning our away day to Blackpool right now. Thank you to Sally, Polly and Danny. We'll be back next time.